Arguably, one of the most crucial as well as most confusing tools found in mixing is compression. In this video, we'll discuss exactly how it works and how we can make the concept go from complicated to clear and applicable. Imagine you're hosting a party where all of your guests are speaking at different volume levels. Some are speaking louder while others are speaking quieter. Now, as the host of the party, it is your job to make sure that everyone enjoys themselves and can be heard. And the same thing can be said about mixing a song, where the goal is to ensure everything happening within our mix sounds consistent, balanced, and audible. So as a host, what will we do to achieve this? Well, ideally we would be walking around the party to each guest, adjusting their volume levels manually, meaning we turn them up whenever they speak too quietly and we turn them down whenever they speak too loudly. So what could this look like in music? Well, take this vocal for example. Without even listening to it, the waveform already tells us that the vocal contains parts that are much louder than other parts. In other words, it has the potential to be more consistent. If we do nothing, the loud parts of our vocal are probably going to sound too loud and dominant in the context of our mix, while the quiet parts will become less audible and will drown in the mix. I want to improve my dynamic range. Now, to resolve this, we can use volume automation, as this allows us to attenuate the peaks and boost the valleys of our vocal, or any sound really, in order to achieve a more consistent output. So let's start off by creating an automation clip of the vocal's volume knob by right-clicking it and choosing Create Automation Clip. And then let's zoom in a bit to have more detailed and precise control over the automation. And let's manually adjust any parts that are too loud, the peaks, by drawing a curve that is opposite to what the waveform is doing. So for the first word, for example, we want to lower the volume of the initial bit of the word and slowly make the automation go louder because the original signal is getting less and less loud. I want it. And this is what we want to do for the entire vocal. Lower the level of the loud parts and raise the level of the more quiet parts to get a more consistent result in terms of volume, which could look something like this. I want to improve my dynamic range. Now, in a way, this is similar to the host of the party walking around to every guest, adjusting their volume level manually. But in real life, this would of course be quite tedious and not very efficient. Volume automation clips work similarly in that we have to manually make adjustments each time something is either too loud or too quiet. And while it does allow for optimal control, it's not the most efficient approach, and that's exactly where compression comes in. Because compression can replace this tedious approach by doing the work for us. Now, compression is an automated and mathematical approach to creating consistency in volume, typically by decreasing the difference between the loudest and the quietest parts of a sound. We just have to set a few controls, and that's going to make sure we don't have to keep running around tweaking each guest's volume level manually, allowing us to relax and enjoy the party ourselves. So let's explain this in a step-by-step way for us to easily understand while connecting to the concept of our party analogy. Basically, every compressor comes with a highly similar set of controls. And the first of these controls, the threshold, is the volume level that we must pass before the volume of our sound gets lowered. And you can think of this as the speaking volume our guests must pass before we tell them to lower their voice. So if someone is speaking louder than this threshold, we're going to lower their volume. Now, our threshold is determined in decibels, where we decide if our sound exceeds that decibel amount, our compressor must act and compensate for that peak. The threshold is the beginning point to the way our compressor responds and works, and its function relies heavily on our ratio, which we'll discuss next. Now, our ratio is the math behind how much reduction will be applied based on the amount of decibels we exceed our threshold. Now, our ratio serves as a fraction, which could look something like this. And the difference between these amounts is the amount of reduction that is happening. If we applied a 2-to-1 ratio at our party, for example, that would mean for every 2 decibels a person speaks above the threshold, we would only allow for half of that amount to actually pass through, which would be 1 decibel of volume above the threshold. Now, if we were to use a ratio of say 10-to-1, That would mean for every 10 decibels our guests exceed the threshold, we would only allow 1 decibel of conversation to pass through, meaning only 10% of the volume above the threshold would be retained after applying compression, which is obviously a much more dramatic reduction in volume. And in the most extreme case, we could even set our ratio to infinity to 1, where we would allow no signal at all to pass through above the threshold, which is considered limiting. Now, the next control to discuss would be the attack, which is the speed at which we as the host will respond to anyone who begins to get too loud. So imagine someone running around the party immediately saying shh to each guest that exceeds our threshold as they begin to do so. That would be an example of a fast attack, while the opposite of that would be a slow attack, where we as the host would more calmly approach each guest and politely tell them that they're being too loud. So basically, the faster the attack, the faster the volume of our guest gets turned down whenever they speak above the threshold. And the slower the attack, the longer it takes for our guest's voice to be lowered. Now, in musical terms, our attack is typically measured in milliseconds, and depending on the instrument, it may call for a fast or a slow attack. For example, if we are compressing a kick because its initial click is too loud, we'd prefer to have a faster attack to mitigate that initial click. But in an opposite situation, we may want to retain that initial click or punch, but have our compressor lower the kick at a later point in order for it to not sound boomy, for example. And in that scenario, we'd opt for a slower attack time. Now, the counterpart to our attack is the release, the other half of the relationship. In compression, our release determines how fast our sound returns to its uncompressed state, or original volume, after it's being compressed. And if we refer to the idea of our party, this is how long it would take between a guest lowering his voice as a result of our shh, and for him to speak at the level he was speaking at before we told him shh. So the faster our release time, the faster our guests' voices will return back to their original volume, while the slower our release time, the longer our guests will sound quieter before returning to their original speaking volume. And then there's a little control on most compressors called knee, which is going to affect how smooth or abrupt we will transition from an uncompressed state to a compressed state once we get close to our threshold. And all you need to know about this control is that its range operates between hard and soft, where a soft knee generally generates results that sound more smooth and natural, while a hard knee typically generates results that sound more abrupt and aggressive. Now, at this point, we may have managed to successfully set our threshold, ratio, attack, release, and knee controls to reach a more consistent and balanced volume level overall, but we may realize we've lost quite a bit of overall party volume by doing so, making our party sound a little bit dull. And that's why we want to gradually increase the overall volume of our guests again, now that we've achieved control from our guests initially speaking over one another. And in compression, this is achieved through the makeup gain control, which makes up for any loss in volume as a result of the compression we have applied. Because when we apply compression, we tend to reduce the level of our sound's peaks, right? Resulting in a quieter signal overall. Say it's 3 dB quieter than it was before compression, then we use makeup gain to turn up the entire signal by 3B again, back to where the original signal's level was before. But now we're going to have a more consistent signal because the parts of the sound that were the quietest before are now relatively louder. Basically, we've decreased the difference between the loudest and quietest parts of our sound, and that's making the sound much more consistent and flat. Okay, so now that we've gone over the basics and controls of compression, it's time to see it in action. Let's go back to our previous vocal example where we applied volume automation to create a more consistent result. But instead of volume automation, let's now use a compressor. On the vocals mixer channel, I am going to load an instance of FabFilter Pro C2, which I've come to really enjoy, especially because of its visual display showing exactly what's happening to the signal. But you can use any compressor plugin here. Now, before we start tweaking knobs, it's important to first always have a goal in mind, like what do we want to achieve through the use of compression? And in this scenario, we want to make sure that the final part of the vocal becomes quieter, so the vocal becomes more consistent overall. And we also want to decrease the difference between the loudest and quietest part parts within each word to make sure the words will sound more consistent and hold up better in the mix. So with these goals in mind, let's turn to our compressor settings. To mitigate the vocal being somewhat uncontrolled in terms of volume, I'm beginning with the threshold at -22 dB, as I found this to be the appropriate point to have our compressor kick in, as it is quite close in volume to the quietest word of our vocal, meaning everything louder than this is being reduced in volume. I'm then working with a ratio of 5:1, meaning for every 5 decibels we exceed our -22 dB threshold, we're only allowing 1 dB of signal to actually pass through. Our attack is set to very fast at 0.5 milliseconds, meaning our signal is being compressed more or less immediately once it exceeds the threshold in order to catch the peaks on some of our words' transients. And finally, I have the release time set to 50 milliseconds, which is a moderate release time, which ensures our output remains consistent throughout each word. Now let's listen to our vocal before and after compression, both in solo and in context of the mix. I want to improve my dynamic range. 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 And as we can tell from listening, as well as from just watching the waveform of the compressed vocal, the final part of the vocal has indeed become quieter, making the vocal more consistent overall. And we also managed to decrease the difference between the loudest and the quietest parts within each word, helping the vocal sound more consistent and also hold up better in the mix. Okay, so now let's check out a different example in which compression may be called for. Revisiting my How to Fret Again track, I wanted to show you how compression can be applied in the context of a kick drum. I felt initially the sample sounded a bit too boomy, lacking some of that control and tightness a great sounding kick drum has, especially in context of the mix. Now to fix this, I'm adding a compressor with the threshold set to -7 dB with a ratio of 4:1 and an attack time of 3 milliseconds, meaning some of the peaks of the kick are going to be caught, but it's still going to have enough punch and transient. And then, because the kick sounds quite boomy and bloated, I'm going to set the release to the fastest time, and I'll bring it up slowly until it feels natural and right, something I'll do while playing it together with the rest of the mix. Now, if we solo the kick, you'll notice the difference between the fastest possible release time, the release time we dialed in, and the slowest possible release time where the kick really doesn't have much of a powerful low-end presence anymore. And altogether, these subtle changes really help alleviate our kick from sounding too boomy and also make it feel more tight and punchy, which in turn makes it sit in the mix a lot better. So let's A/B the result to hear what the compression is doing. Now, as a last example, we can also use compression on a bus in order to make sure all of our drums sound more cohesive. So let's take a look at the drum bus on my Summer Dance Jam track, where I felt the kick specifically sounded boomy and the snare could sound more glued together to the rest of the drums. So after routing the different drum mixer tracks to a new channel, which I call drum bus, I loaded an instance of Pro C2, setting the threshold to -9.5 dB with a ratio of 5:1, release time to 600 milliseconds, and an attack time of 1 millisecond to make sure that the compression sounds moderate without it being too light or harsh of a change. And as a result, we have a more consistent and unified drum mix that takes care of that initial boomy sound from the kick and also alleviates our snare from sounding too snappy. Now, to take things further, let's discuss another concept of compression, which is called parallel compression, also known as New York compression. And this is a compression technique with the goal of delivering a more powerful presence to the audio track it is applied to. Now, the concept works by duplicating a sound, heavily compressing the duplicate, and subtly playing it parallel to the original signal to create more power and body without messing up the dynamics of our original signal, which works great on, for example, drums. To illustrate this technique, let's look at the How to Billie Eilish song I made a while ago, which has some cool drum elements. However, I feel the drums could sound more powerful, and that's exactly why a technique like parallel compression is called for. So how do we do it? First, we make sure our drums are routed to a drum bus. To do that, we have to select all of our drum mixer channels by holding Control or Command and selecting them. And we're going to use the Route to this track only option to link them to an empty insert channel, which we'll call drum bus. Now we're going to duplicate the signal of this channel by sidechaining it to a new empty track, which we'll call parallel, and loading up an instance of Fruity Send on our drum bus, which we'll send to our parallel track. Now, if we play the song now, we'll see that both the drum bus and the parallel mixer tracks are playing the signals of our drum sounds. Okay, so on the parallel mixer track, let's now load a compressor and let's choose some extreme settings. A very low threshold, a super high ratio, a fast attack, and a slow release preferably. And now let's set the level of this parallel track all the way down to 0, and let's start turning it up gradually while playing the rest of our mix simultaneously until we hear that it nicely adds power to our drums. Something like that. Now, as a rule of thumb for parallel compression on drums, I basically have two guidelines. If you want to double your drums with a thick full sound, then a fast attack and slow release on the parallel track will typically work well. While second, if you want to add smack and punch to your drums, then you generally want to set a slower attack and a fast release on the parallel bus. Now, in the example of our drums, we wanted to achieve the former, which is why we opted for a fast attack and a slow release time, which definitely added quite a bit of power to our drums once we dialed in that parallel track. But I'd like to point out that there is no such thing as a one-size-fits-all approach, whether it comes to compression or parallel compression. For the best results, you'll always want to have a goal in mind for the sound at hand and use the logic behind the controls of compression to try and realize that goal. Now, these were some of my perspectives on compression. If you'd like to learn more about another great application of compression, which is called sidechain compression, then I definitely recommend you to go watch this video next. Also, if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel to become part of our community of musicians and music lovers. And with that said, I'd like to thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.